Hello, audience. Just a super quick note before we begin, because, first of all, this conversation with William Taubman about McNamara, Vietnam, the Cold War, nuclear weapons, one of my favorite conversations that I've had on the show. So I want to just get to that super quickly, but one quick announcement. Namely, and this is for all the people that are following the Boethius Consolation of Philosophy book project, which is, I have the final book in the Consolation of Philosophy. I have the narration done. I just need to edit it, and it will go up right after this episode. I want to thank everybody who dropped ratings and backed that project on Patreon. We are almost over the finish line with a unlimited, non-copyright, public domain English version of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy in audiobook. So very close to the finish line on that. Now, without any further ado, presenting his new book, McNamara at War, Pulitzer Prize-winning Cold War historian William Taubman. Alrighty, it is Wednesday, August 20th, and I am joined today by William Taubman, the Bertrand Snell Professor of Political Science Emeritus at Amherst College. His new book, McNamara at War, about Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and the war in Vietnam, is co-written with his brother Philip Taubman and comes out September 23rd. I was given an advance copy to review, and it is my great pleasure today to be sitting down with Professor Taubman to talk about the Cold War, Vietnam, U.S. foreign policy, and Robert McNamara. Bill, welcome to the show.
Glad to be with you, Will.
So there's this McNamara story that he tells in The Fog of War, the Errol Morris documentary, where they interview him near the end stage of his life and they ask about some of his decision making. And he talks about how during the Vietnam War and during the Cold War in general, the State Department, the CIA, the U.S. government in general, put significant resources into understanding the perspective of the Soviets. And he felt that, he says in the Fog of War, that we had empathy for the Soviets. We could put ourselves in their shoes. And he said, we never really did that with the Vietnamese. And that was part of the reason why we lost the Vietnam War, ultimately. Do you agree with the basic premise that the United States government during, say, the 60s or the early 70s had an accurate picture of what was going on politically in the Soviet Union, that they could empathize with them, and that they couldn't have that same diplomatic clarity with the Vietnamese?
No, I don't think I do. I think we may have tried to understand the Soviets and even empathize with them in order better to deal with them. But I know from having written the biography of Khrushchev that we never fully understood him. In fact, one of the ironies of that period is that two of the most potentially explosive crises of the Cold War in Berlin and in Cuba both occurred because Khrushchev was actually trying to broker talks that might have eased the Cold War, but he chose to go about it in a way that seemed to us to be exacerbating the Cold War, and we responded in kind, and we got those crises. So I think they were both classic cases of to an extent misunderstanding based on misconception.
So let's walk through those two examples. So let's talk about Berlin and then Cuba. So what happened in Berlin? I think 61, right? Checkpoint Charlie.
Yes. Well, what happened in Berlin, the Berlin crisis really began in 1958.
Sure.
When Khrushchev suddenly declared that if the West and the United States didn't sign a peace treaty ending World War II, there had been no such treaty, then he would proceed to deal on his own with East Germany and perhaps ban travel to Berlin, which was located within East Germany, by Western troops. And we took that as a terrific challenge. What Khrushchev was actually trying to do was to force his way into a summit conference with Eisenhower and possibly the French and the British too, as a way of settling or at least easing the tensions of the Cold War. But we took this as a challenge and a very dangerous one to a vital interest of ours in the heart of Europe. And so we got the Berlin crisis out of that. In Cuba, Khrushchev was trying to protect, well, he had several motives, but one, he was trying to protect Cuba from a repeat of the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles in April 1961. And his way of doing that was to put Soviet missiles in Cuba capable of reaching the United States. Again, a very strange way to proceed. And again, we took that as a potentially mortal threat, and we had a Cuban crisis. Khrushchev was very hard to read. He was an explosive, colorful, explosive character, and his way of reaching out was to do so with a kind of mailed fist and force us into peace negotiations. But we didn't see that, and we took this as challenges which we had to respond to.
Well, what about, certainly with Khrushchev, so let's talk a little bit, if we're going to talk about Khrushchev, about his origins and where he comes from. I mean, he comes from a peasant society, right? Like a very poorly educated background in pre-revolutionary Russia. And then he has this meteoric ascent to power, which you describe in your book. And what were the early influences on Khrushchev? How did he come to see himself relative to other people around him?
Well, first of all, you say Khrushchev had a minimal education.
No. He came from a minimally educated society.
But he had only 2 years of formal education in a peasant school. Now, he returned twice later in his life to try to extend his education, but both times he ended up being distracted by politics and joining the Communist Party and working for it. So he never really got much of an education at all. And I think that was a crucial influence on him. He was once described by the Soviet sculptor who made the monument that stands at his grave in Moscow. This is a man named Ernst Neizvestny. Neizvestny described Khrushchev as the most uncultured man I ever met. So he was kind of a clean slate for whatever propaganda he encountered. And he encountered plenty of it from the Communist Party, which he joined and eventually led. So he was influenced by what he took to be the precepts of Marxist-Leninist, Stalinist ideology. He was influenced by the caricature of the West, which was conveyed in that propaganda, and therefore he saw the West and the United States in particular as a threat, but also such a threat that it would be worthwhile trying to make peace. And he went about trying to make peace in this erratic, hard to read way, which actually raised tensions rather than reducing them.
Let's look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. The way the story is told from the American point of view is that the balance of power, or the overall geostrategic condition, was totally upended by sneaking these missiles into Cuba and then failing to announce them. That this had tilted the nuclear scales decidedly in favor of the Soviet Union, that these missiles were threatening 90 million Americans. But in a significant way, what had actually happened, if you look at the broader picture, is that the nuclear strategy on the planet had been balanced, because the United States had missiles in Turkey, had Polaris submarines, had much closer intermediate range missiles and submarine launched ballistic missiles that could reach Moscow. And the installation of the missiles in Cuba brought the Soviets not beyond the American nuclear capability, but into parity, strategic balance with the United States. Do you think that's accurate?
That's accurate, but there's more to it than that. Because if you go back to the late 50s and to the U.S. election of 1960, the Republicans and Eisenhower were claiming that there was a missile gap in the Soviets' favor, that they had many more intercontinental missiles capable of striking the United States from Soviet bases. And then, lo and behold, when we got the ability to look down from our satellites and see what they really had, it turned out we had the missile gap in our favor. And we announced that in 1961. And that was a shock to Khrushchev to discover that the alleged missile gap, which he was using as a sort of hammer to scare the West, turned out to be in the hands of his foes. So placing the missiles in Cuba within reach of the United States was partly a way to close the American missile gap in Washington's favor. But of course, what Washington saw was suddenly missiles 90 miles from our shores. And in the early deliberations within the executive committee in the White House of the National Security Council, one of the first things they discussed was, did the missiles in Cuba change the real balance of power? And interestingly enough, the man we are going to be discussing in a little while, Robert McNamara, the American Defense Secretary, actually said, no, those missiles did not change the balance of power, because we were still far, far ahead of the Soviet Union in intercontinental missiles, of which they had very, very few. But the other people in the executive committee, especially the military people, insisted that McNamara was wrong, that this did change the balance of power, and that therefore we had to find a way to get those missiles out of Cuba.
Well, let's talk about McNamara. So McNamara enters the picture politically in 1960, coming on as Secretary of Defense for, well, I guess he comes on a little bit later, actually, but Secretary of Defense for Kennedy, stays Secretary of Defense for Johnson, and is in charge of overseeing and carrying out the Vietnam War. So what is McNamara's story up to that point? What's his sort of pocket biography? Where does he come from?
He was born in California, and he went to Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. From there, he went to Harvard Business School, and then when just after he was appointed an instructor at Harvard Business School, the war was beginning, and he went into the Army, and he ended up waging war by, we have a chapter called Waging War by Numbers, because what he tried to do was to apply to the Air Force, the U.S. Air Force, some of the techniques which had been developed at Harvard Business School and elsewhere to sort of get control of logistics, to know exactly how many planes they had, and how many sorties the planes had flown, and how many bombs they could carry, and how far they could go, and take what had been a disorganized Air Force and organize it and make it usable, which is what he did during World War II. And at the end of World War II, he moved around during the war, but at the end he was briefly in Guam working with General Curtis LeMay as LeMay launched the fire bombing of Tokyo, which killed about 100,000 Japanese civilians. McNamara was involved in that. He was not the main organizer of that, but he was giving them advice about that it needed to be done and how it could be done. And he felt forever guilty about that. From there, when the war was over, he went to work for the Ford Motor Company, and he worked his way up to the top, so that several weeks before Kennedy called and invited him to Washington, McNamara became the first president of Ford who was not a member of the Ford family. Now, what I've given you is a sort of step-by-step account of his climbing the ladder, but I would summarize it differently in this way. I would say McNamara was a brilliant man who mastered everything he touched and every place he was, from the first grade through Berkeley, through Harvard, through the military, through Ford, even the first few years in Washington. He mastered everything he touched until the Vietnam War mastered him. That is to say, he was a brilliant success at every level until he was put in charge of the Vietnam War, which he couldn't manage and failed miserably as the manager of.
I think it's a classic example of the old joke that everyone is promoted to the point of incompetence. Did great in college, then it's off to Harvard Business School, and then we're planning with LeMay, the bombing campaign in the Pacific. And then, afterwards on to Ford and turning Ford around. And finally, the one unsolvable problem, which is waging the war in Vietnam. And what comes through in your book is a picture of McNamara where, perhaps the cultural stereotype of McNamara, I think one of his critics called him an IBM computer with legs, this sort of robotic, quantitative, numbers-oriented person who's sort of machine-like or robotic and believes that, everything can be carried out through the right set of abstractions. But then, there's also, a warmer picture of McNamara that's present in your book, somebody who has a highly developed moral conscience. He took political philosophy, he took ethics and he took logic in college at Berkeley and really enjoyed those courses. He read poetry like Rudyard Kipling. So he clearly had a sensitive, humane side to him. He was an Eagle Scout, like me, incidentally. Oh. And so I can understand certain elements of McNamara's biography. There's certain areas where his background actually overlaps with mine, which frightens me because I do believe that Robert McNamara is a war criminal and someone who was involved in ordering the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in a conflict that he didn't understand, a war that was fundamentally wrong and immoral, not just a mistake. And so can we talk about Vietnam before before the Kennedy administration? So where does the U.S. involvement in Vietnam begin, and why choose to get involved in the first place?
The involvement in Vietnam really began during the Second World War or shortly afterwards. Vietnam had been a French colony. The Japanese took it over during the war. The French got it back after the war. And then they began to lose to the nationalists/communists based in the north, but also functioning as guerrillas in the south. And at a famous battle, which I think was in 58, but I'd have to check, at Dien Bien Phu, the French...
I think that was 54.
Yeah, maybe it was 54, yeah. Well, we have to see. But the French fought to try to get control or keep control, and they lost, which raised then the question of what would happen to South Vietnam, which was not run by the communists. And the Americans decided in the course of the 50s that South Vietnam was worth defending and trying to make sure the North Vietnamese communists didn't take it over. Eisenhower was not willing to send troops. And so when Kennedy came in 1960, this was still an issue. And he decided gradually to move in using advisors, not combat troops. And that's what happened essentially from 1961, Kennedy's inauguration, through 1963, Kennedy's assassination. And it was only in 64 and 65 that the Johnson administration, with McNamara in a key position in it, decided that they had to send combat troops to actually fight the North Vietnamese communists and the South Vietnamese guerrillas. Why did they do that? They had a view of the world in which the loss of South Vietnam to the North Vietnamese communists would lead by a kind of domino effect to the loss of all of Southeast Asia. And the loss of all of Southeast Asia would lead by a further domino effect to the loss of Japan. And the loss of Japan, meaning the loss of all of Asia, would leave Europe isolated in the world, or Western Europe. And so in effect, what they tied together was the threat of the loss of South Vietnam to the loss of everything, leading to the isolation of the United States in the world. Now, this is a hell of a sequence, which they imagined that it would frighten them, but they believed it. They believed it, and I think that was the heart of the reason why we ended up in the war that we did in Vietnam.
Having myself now read a number of State Department planning documents or, contingency plans coming out of the Joint Chiefs, declassified documents. This is one of the great skills of American planners, is the ability to pick any particular thing, like a submarine pin in Iceland, and say, if we lose this, through this 10-step process, NATO will be dissolved, Western Europe will be conquered by the Soviets, the Middle East will be invaded, we'll lose out on the petroleum supply. And it's the ability to connect the fate of the world to, for example, the political situation in a country like South Vietnam in 1963, 1964. There's this telescoping effect where the Cold War just serves as an infinite pretext. What do we need to do? We need to enforce credibility in Southeast Asia in order to continue to control the region, in order to protect U.S. business interests in the region. And, what's our pretext for that? The domino theory, the Soviet menace, the ruthless and monolithic conspiracy. And so why did the United States help the French? I think this is an important part of the story. The United States was paying 80% of the French war costs in the period where they were battling against Vietnamese independence. Why was the U.S. Working with the French to prevent Vietnamese independence? Or do you agree with that characterization?
Well, I'd like to go back and argue with you, Will, a little bit, because I think I heard you say that the domino theory and the extended fear of communist triumphs around the world was a pretext. Did you not say that?
It was a pretext in the sense that it was ultimately disproven. The domino theory was shown to be false. I do agree that people genuinely believed it and convinced themselves of it, particularly the NSC. The NSC was the civilian policy planners were especially susceptible to this form of paranoia. But I do agree that they themselves were convinced of it.
Yes, that's what I wanted to say. A pretext I would define as an excuse that you don't really believe in for something that you do want to do. And this was not a pretext in the sense that it was a genuine fear. Now, you use the word paranoia. That's different. That's a kind of fear which really has no basis in truth, but nonetheless scares you. And I think of another phrase that is often used in this kind of discussion, and that is worst case thinking. This was a hell of a worst case, to think that the loss of South Vietnam would lead to the loss of all of Asia and potentially even Europe and the isolation of the United States. This was this was so bad a case as to be almost unbelievable. And I suppose if you got into an argument with one of these guys and really had at it for several hours, you might have been able to get them to admit that it was a worst case and it was not. It was still a stretch. But in that sense, they did use it, because once they decided to proceed, they focused on the war, the battles, and all the rest, and left the overarching explanation of their motivation sort of off to one side. But even McNamara himself, one of the things we discovered, Phil, my brother and I, as we worked on the book, was that even after he decided that the war in Vietnam was probably militarily unwinnable, and that therefore the real thing we should do was get out, even after he decided that, he could never bring himself to say that to President Johnson. And one of many reasons why he could never bring himself to say that was that he looked around at all the people he was working with, and he saw that none of them agreed with him. That is to say, Dean Rusk, McGeorge Bundy, General Westmoreland, all these people believed in the worst case theory. And
what about George Ball?
George Ball was the one exception. But the point I was making was that one of the reasons that McNamara kept his mouth shut was that he wasn't absolutely sure that he was right. right in believing that the war was unwinnable if all these other people thought it was winnable, not only was winnable, but must be won.
Hmm.
That was only one reason why he didn't tell that to Johnson. There were other reasons. One was ambition. He didn't want to lose his position. But even that gets complicated because why did he want to remain Secretary of Defense? Partly because it gave him power and reputation and glory potentially and all the rest, but also because he thought he could work within the system to restrain forces in the military and the White House who, without him, would be free to escalate in the war, to take it to North Vietnam, and to run the risk of bringing in China, as China had come in Korea, and even the Soviet Union, leading by another extension of another worst case to an actual nuclear war.
But I mean, short of a nuclear war, the actual worst case scenario did happen, which was that 3 to 4 million people were killed in Southeast Asia, and the country went communist anyway, right? And so there's a strange way in which this kind of worst case scenario thinking spirals out of control. For example, I'm reminded of a line that Dick Cheney took during the lead up to the American war in Iraq, where he said that if there's a 1% chance that Saddam Hussein is developing weapons of mass destruction, then we have to treat it as if it's a 100% certainty. And the domino theory logic, I mean, first of all, it was short-circuited in 1965 with the massacre of the PKI in Indonesia. Indonesia, a country that had been, teetering sort of between third world socialism, leaning slightly towards the Soviets, experienced a US-backed military coup in which a right-wing dictatorship under Suharto came to power. And that was a much greater material and strategic prize for the United States than Vietnam. Similarly, Japan never came anywhere close to becoming a communist. Neither did Thailand or Singapore, Malaysia. And so the reason why I call the domino theory a pretext is because it's a speculation based on not very much material evidence, not very much history, which authorizes the use of, U.S. imperial force in a region far away from, the country.
Yes, but when you're in a situation that McNamara was in, surrounded by people who believed it and feared it, and who I won't say they didn't mind killing hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, but they thought that was just the necessary price. That's what happens in war. In fact, we can see that today in Gaza. We can see that in Sudan. We can see that in Ukraine. And it's horrifying. People console themselves, if console is the right word, if they even worry about it at all, saying this is war. People die in war. And it's one of the reasons that I spent a year in the State Department, 1970, 71, as a fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations. I was a graduate student. I guess I'd gotten my PhD, and I was already teaching at Amherst. And I wanted to experience as best I could the situation within the system, within the State Department, within the government. And I came away thinking, that's not for me. That's not for me. I don't want to engage in bureaucratic battles, which I might lose or win, but in which the cost would be people's lives. I wanted to go back to Amherst and teach and write books, which is what I did. But it's horrifying how many people get used to the idea of killing tons of other people for some allegedly paramount aim, which turns out in the end to be itself faulty.
And what's disturbing about McNamara is that he doesn't seem like Genghis Khan. He doesn't seem like someone who believes in the glorification of violence or takes any intrinsic has any intrinsic drive towards this violent approach to world affairs, but someone who in part appears to be trapped inside a massive military system. In fact, the same system that Eisenhower warned about in his farewell address. and also someone who, wanted to be influential, wanted to be powerful. And it's sort of a combination of these two factors of McNamara's belief in his own personal greatness, that he was an intellectual genius who could understand and prosecute the war in a way that nobody else could, his authentic, patriotism and loyalty and desire to serve the United States and protect it, and then a certain aspect of conformity that you alluded to when you said that he wanted to warn Johnson that the war was unwinnable, but would have been cutting across literally everybody else in the room. I mean, I'm not someone that overly celebrates John F. Kennedy, but I do think that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy's leadership was decisive because everyone around him in the Joint Chiefs, like LeMay is the most extreme example, but, all of his ex-com group wanted a much more aggressive reaction to Cuba, including bombings. And Kennedy stuck exclusively to the blockade and to back-channel negotiations. And that, in combination with Khrushchev's willingness to defuse the crisis, is the only reason that, the world exists today. That's the only reason we survived Armageddon. And I see with McNamara that unwillingness to tell a hard truth, the unwillingness to go against consensus, that to me is the crime.
Well, let me say a word of picking up on the Cuban crisis and then back to the larger question of McNamara. In the Cuban crisis, for the most part, McNamara was a voice of support for less rather than more, for a blockade rather than an attack or an invasion of Cuba. There were moments when they were preparing over the last weekend of the crisis for the possibility, and in fact the probability, that if there was no settlement, they would attack the missile sites and invade Cuba. And at that point, in his role as Secretary of Defense, he was helping to prepare the ground for that invasion. But otherwise, he was a voice, along with Bobby Kennedy and President Kennedy himself, for restraint. But back to your larger point, I think McNamara is, in his own way, a tragic figure because he did understand that the war was unwinnable. He wanted to slow it. He really wanted to stop it. He was unable to stop it. And while remaining in government, having failed to stop it, he managed it. And he was behind the killing of thousands, tens of thousands. But then we find him saying, I'm a son of a bitch. We find him saying, I killed tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands. We find him chastising himself for doing all of that. We find him trying after the war, 20 years later, joining in an effort to understand, with the help of the North Vietnamese, at meetings in Hanoi, why the war started and why it continued and why he had been unable to stop it, why the Vietnamese had not come into the negotiations that he had tirelessly tried to start. And in the process, he decided that he was at fault. He was a bastard. And I compare him to somebody like McGeorge Bundy, who we discovered at one point in the same early 90s, was at a conference of some sort or dinner where some younger person actually said, Bundy, you fucked up, didn't you, in Vietnam? And Bundy actually brought himself to say the kind of thing that McNamara would have said was, yes, I did, but I'm not going to ruin the rest of my life thinking about that. I'm not going to blame myself. I'm just going to get on with my life. So there was the difference. McNamara tormented himself for the rest of his life. He even, according to his wife, his second wife, his widow, contemplated suicide in the sense that he deserved to kill himself, to die, to make amends for what he had done. That is extraordinary. That is really extraordinary. And in that sense, I think he is, he is a tragic figure, as I said.
What seems tragic to me about McNamara is that he comes, like, for example, to keep going back to that interview, the fog of war. There's all these moments where you can feel that he's just 1 millimeter away from getting it, and then doesn't get it. And I'll give you an example. So he talks about the protesters outside the Pentagon while he was Secretary of Defense, right? And in one case, a protester self-immolated in front of the Pentagon, and McNamara actually watched that happen. And then later in '67, the Pentagon was surrounded by protesters, and it was the late '60s was a time of great political upheaval in the United States, and DC in particular was inundated with huge numbers of very militant, very passionate protesters who were opposed to the draft and opposed to the war. And McNamara saw that, as did everyone around him. And so Errol Morris, the filmmaker, asks him, what did you make of, the protests and the self-immolation? And he said, oh, that was a terrible thing to watch. It affected me very deeply. I had empathy and so on for the protesters, and it is a terrible thing, and human beings need to stop killing other human beings. And then the follow-up question was, in this time when the protests were happening, how did your thinking change? And there's a beat, and then he just says, it didn't change at all. All those protesters did not do a single thing to change my thinking.
It's
and
even
the filmmaker goes, why? And he goes, it was the Cold War. And that's what I mean about an infinite pretext. It's like this, the whole, it was the Cold War. It was the cataclysmic clash of the United States and the Soviet Union. There was no alternative. There was no legitimate debate. And that to me is what's tragic, is that he got wrapped in this ideology that prevented him from thinking.
The story you tell, I would add one detail, which is devastating, even more devastating. In one of the things we read, it might have been Errol Morris's transcript, or maybe not. We read notes of McNamara's interviews with a lot of people who interviewed him, helping him to prepare the manuscript of his book. But in one of those conversations, talking about that demonstration in which the protesters surrounded the Pentagon and faced troops whom McNamara had mobilized to protect the Pentagon, although without carrying arms, I believe. Anyway, McNamara says, at the end of this discussion, he says, if I had been leading those protesters, we would have closed down the Pentagon. So suddenly this story, suddenly it's as if the other side of McNamara, the ambitious, brilliant, arrogant side, comes leaping out of his apologies and says, if I'd been there, we could have closed down the Pentagon. He can't resist the thought of how well he would have handled not just resisting the demonstration, but leading it.
The reason why the protesters didn't succeed in changing the Pentagon is they didn't use enough Agent Orange or white phosphorus or cluster munitions. Geez, wow. Can we talk just for a little bit about the air war in Vietnam? I think there are few events in history that had the ferocious violence of the U.S. aerial assault on Vietnam. What was that like on the ground in reality? Because, okay, McNamara, he's back at the Defense Department. He's heavily optimizing, the sorties and doing a systematic prosecution of the war. But what's actually happening in Vietnam as a result of the decisions that he's making?
People are dying. American soldiers are getting infected with Agent Orange and developing cancers to this day. I forget, maybe you remember this, Will, but there's a figure that more bombs were dropped in Vietnam than in all of Europe in World War II. That may not be the exact parallel or comparison, but there's something like that. More bombs dropped in Vietnam than in maybe 1 year of World War II. That is somewhere in our book, but I don't remember it.
Between 1960 and 1975, the U.S. dropped more bombs on Vietnam than all the bombs that had been dropped by all sides in all of World War II.
Okay, it is.
That's the true statistic.
There it is.
It is an intensity of bombing without precedent, and I don't think it's ever been repeated, although the Israelis are trying right now in Gaza. But yeah, it's ferocious.
I think McNamara had paid attention in World War II to the effect of bombing on Germany, and whether it had broken the will of the German population, and whether it had forced an end to the war. And he knew enough to know that bombing had not accomplished that aim. And
which was not the consensus with other people as well. The one of the false lessons learned was that strategic bombing or terror bombing, civilian bombing, that did actually work and attrite the will to fight of the enemy. Sorry to cut you off, but people thinking strategic bombing works is one of the most catastrophic things you can ever think, in my opinion.
McNamara knew strategic bombing didn't work, and he had tried to limit the extent of it. Of course, once it was decided to do it by Johnson and the others, he was involved in sending them off. But he had deep skepticism about that. And that was part of his desire to limit the war if he couldn't end it. He, as I've said before, he wanted to end it. He wanted to say it should be ended, but he didn't dare say that to Johnson. But he didn't want to expand it. And one of the big tensions throughout the war was between McNamara on the one hand and the Joint Chiefs on the other, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, or between McNamara and Westmoreland. But then, speaking of Westmoreland, here's another interesting twist, which offers a kind of insight into McNamara. McNamara and Westmoreland had a tense relationship. McNamara resisted Westmoreland's calls for hundreds of thousands of more combat troops, trying to limit them at various times. But then in 1984, when Westmoreland sued CBS television for claiming...
Wait, really?
Yeah, claiming in a TV broadcast that Westmoreland had distorted the situation in Vietnam in order to get permission to escalate the bombing. McNamara broke his almost 20 years of silence on the war and insisted on testifying at the trial that Westmoreland was an honest man who had not distorted the record in order to get permission to escalate the bombing. So there is McNamara again. On the one hand, part of the bombing, on the other hand, defending Westmoreland against what charge that he thought was unjust.
I want to kind of zoom out and look at McNamara's thinking beyond particular flashpoints like Vietnam or Cuba or Berlin. How did McNamara imagine that the Cold War would end? How did he imagine that the United States would ultimately win the Cold War in a world filled with nuclear weapons?
Well, I'm not sure he did imagine the Cold War would end. If you look at his book in retrospect, after his account of his life, although mostly it's about Vietnam, it has a kind of epilogue where it contains his recipe for how to avoid future Vietnams. I don't have it in front of me, but he has a series of policy suggestions, which include understanding the enemy, empathizing with the enemy, understanding the limits of military power, making sure that when you go to war, you have Congress with you rather than against you, making sure that you don't act unilaterally, but together with your allies. These are a series of suggestions that had they been taken seriously and adopted, might have prevented the war in Iraq and even in Afghanistan. That's a might have been. That's hard to prove. But they show that he was looking for a way to limit America's Cold War adventures as part of an effort to end the Cold War. So that was one of the things, that series of lessons that he propounds at the end of his book are lessons he learned the hard way in Vietnam. Although you may conclude that this set of recommendations wasn't enough And in fact, that leads us to why the Cold War ended. And I'm moving slightly to the left so that you can see behind me a portrait of Gorbachev,
Oh yeah.
whose
Oh yeah.
biography I also wrote. And I think Gorbachev is the one who is particularly responsible for ending the Cold War. Without Gorbachev, the Cold War would have continued. Reagan played a part in it that I describe in the book. And Reagan was willing to say that the Cold War was over when other Americans, including his successor, George H.W. Bush, was not. But Gorbachev was the one who broke the mold and ended the Cold War.
Oh yeah, we're big Gorbachev fans over at the History of Philosophy Audio Archive. Since we're on the subject, I mean, I don't know when else I'm going to get to ask about this. So, did you see, for instance, that there's a movie coming up about the Reykjavik summit between Gorbachev and Reagan? They're turning that into a movie.
Is it? It's a feature film or is it a documentary?
Yeah. No, it's a docudrama. So it's fully gonna be fully acted, right? They're gonna cast people as, Reagan and Gorbachev.
Yeah.
But it should be coming out in the next year or so. But I've always been fascinated with the Reykjavik summit as a sort of emblem of this missed opportunity at world peace. I mean, Reagan essentially walked out of this peace summit with Gorbachev when there was an agenda item on the table to eliminate all nuclear weapons from the respective US and Soviet stockpiles.
Yeah.
And Reagan didn't do it because he wanted Star Wars, because he wanted weapons in space, because he wanted SDI. And I've always, I like trying to imagine Gorbachev's disappointment at that summit is extremely difficult. But can you say a bit about what Gorbachev wanted coming into Reykjavik and what happened?
Well, Gorbachev's period in power was marked by the breaking of all kinds of taboos and axioms of the Cold War. Gorbachev wanted to end it, not just to ease it. This didn't happen immediately. In the beginning, he wanted to ease it, but then he really tried to end it. And in doing so, he alienated the Soviet generals, many of the Communist Party leaders, in agreeing to allow the reunification of Germany, even agreeing against his better instincts to allow what the Americans insisted on, which was the membership in NATO of the reunified Germany. He alienated almost everybody in the Soviet elite, who eventually got rid of him. And Reagan, when Reagan got back to Washington after Reykjavik, he was roundly condemned by all sorts of Americans in Congress and in the military. Margaret Thatcher came all the way to the United States to take Reagan behind the barn, as Reagan later put it, or somebody later put it, and tell him he was nuts. So to go as far as Gorbachev wanted to go, and to go almost that far, which is how far Reagan went, took incredible guts. But it was going against all the givens and all the institutions and all the biases and all the prejudices which were part of the Cold War.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of those biases and prejudices, you alluded to your time in the State Department, right, which was around 1970 or 71?
Yes, I was there in the 70-71.
There's a sort of, I don't know, rumor or overall description of both the State Department and the CIA during the Cold War, where over time they gradually fired everyone who had genuine expertise about the Soviet Union because they all seemed too soft or too pink, and that over the course of the years, especially in the CIA, they didn't have anybody left who had genuine insight, which is why the CIA didn't predict, for example, the fall of the Soviet Union, one of their major responsibilities. And that there's this sort of internal, almost bureaucratic process where anyone who is too empathetic or too sympathetic towards the Soviets or the Russians in general, whether it's culturally, politically, etc., anyone who has some basis of understanding they can reach out with, all those people get pushed out of the system, the foreign policy apparatus.
I think you're describing the current moment under Trump.
Oh, no doubt. It's not like that ended with the Cold War, but
In fact, the paper today and yesterday talked about the firing of 37 high-level experts on Russia, who Trump doesn't want around with their expertise to tell him that what he's doing is crazy. But I must say, in those years from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I was not in. I left the government after 1 year. I never went back. But I knew people in the government, in the embassy, in the CIA, in the State Department, and I think you exaggerate the degree to which they were all the people with some expertise, which included recognizing that Gorbachev was for real and that he wanted to end the Cold War and that we must reach out to him. There were plenty of them still there.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I'm repeating stuff third hand just to see if there's anything to it. But that is...
Well, I wanted to we were talking about where McNamara came from and where he got this mixture of arrogance and aggressiveness on the one hand and remorse and even self-torment on the other. As you know from reading the first chapters in our book, we devote quite a few pages to his parents and his upbringing. And I think it turns out that was very important. I've tried to, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, but I've taught for 10 years a course on personality and political leadership with a professor of psychology at Amherst College. And I learned enough to pay attention to the parents and their impact on the child. And it's quite amazing. His mother was on the one hand pushing McNamara to excel, to exceed, to be a star. It's almost embarrassing to read her discussion of how brilliant he is and what he must achieve.
The letters she wrote to him when he was in his 20s and 30s. Yeah.
Yes, those letters. Yes. But on the other hand, she also prepared him to, how shall I say it? She also prepared him to have a conscience. She pushed him into here you said you were an Eagle Scout. The Boy Scout law, right? There are 12 things a Boy Scout is supposed to be: honest, et cetera.
Trustworthy, loyal, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. Yep, still got it after,
yes.
10 years.
And that's what McNamara appeared to be as a young man, and his friends thought of him that way. And his friends later in life thought of him that way. So she prepared him to try to break through to supremacy in whatever he touched, but she also prepared him to feel guilty when he didn't measure up to the highest standards of rectitude as exemplified in the Boy Scout law. Now, I don't want to reduce McNamara to his mother and his mother's precepts or pretexts or anything else, but I think you can't understand McNamara without understanding her and his relationship with her, and also his father. His father was cold fish, distant, aloof. One of the most interesting things that we learned in working on the book from Craig McNamara, who was McNamara's son, was that he thought that his father, Robert McNamara, was cold and difficult and distant in part because his father, that is Craig's grandfather, had been that way. And to put it in another way, McNamara had never learned how to be a good father from his father.
Yeah, the picture that emerges from Robert McNamara's early childhood is that this very protective, moralistic mother who is very engaged with him, and then a father who is just sitting in the corner reading his paper. Never gonna take him out to play ball, never gonna meet any of his friends, not one to sit down and have heart-to-heart conversations. And I'm writing a double biography right now, and I'm having to ask myself a lot of these questions of how do you characterize or extrapolate from someone's early childhood experience, which psychology shows over and over in so many ways is hugely significant, and how do you get a picture of where these people's beliefs come from very early in life, and does it set the mold for who they'll be later? Do they rebel against everything they're taught, or do they carry it out? That's an interesting breakpoint in personality, is the people that have their experience of their upbringing and say, I'm going to run with this, and this is who I am for the rest of my life, and the people who push back and violently contradict the rules of their upbringing. It seems like McNamara was had something of a people-pleasing dimension to him when it comes to authority, or he wanted, in I think you allude to this in the book, that people like Kennedy and Johnson and Henry Ford too became sort of like surrogate father figures for him. Yeah.
Yes. There's also another line from the book that's I think came from Eugene Zuckert, who overlapped with McNamara at Harvard Business School, became a co-instructor with McNamara there, later became McNamara's Secretary of the Air Force. And he says, this is a paraphrase, but close. McNamara is never more certain than when he is giving voice to something that his boss wants him to say, but with which he basically disagrees.
Isn't
that
That's perplexing? Yes. Yeah. Yes, it is.
Will, I have a question for you. May I ask? Maybe you don't want to answer. Whose biography are you writing? Well, I'd
love to answer. I'm writing a double biography of Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein. I'm exploring the origins of the nuclear nonproliferation and peace movement following the end of World War II. I'm looking at the history of international pacifism and pugwash and the post-Manhattan nuclear scientists in their political action campaign, the origins of nonviolent resistance. But I'm choosing to tell that story through the lives of Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein. Russell was one of the century's greatest analytic philosophers, a logician, one of my favorite authors. He wrote a book which profoundly affected my life, The History of Western Philosophy. And Einstein, who was actually friends with Russell beginning in the 1920s, and they carried on an extensive correspondence, which culminated in 1955 with this thing called the Einstein-Russell Manifesto, or the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, which was a warning delivered at a news conference signed by 11 current and future Nobel laureates, calling on all the powerful governments of the world to abolish war and nuclear weapons as a condition for future human survival. And so for me, politically, that's where the genuinely radical possibility lies within the Cold War, which is once you realize that human survival is incompatible with tens of thousands of nuclear weapons and automated systems that fire those weapons on warning, and the mercurial, crazy personalities of people like Nixon or Trump, who end up with their fingers on those buttons, that the only logical possibility remaining is a new stage of human evolution in which war as a means to resolve international conflict is abolished, in the same way that we've abolished something like the international slave trade. And Albert Einstein signed that letter written by Russell in 1955. And that was the last thing he did before he died, is putting his signature on the manifesto. So that's what the book is about. And really everything has its origins in World War I. And so right now I'm looking very closely at the political situation post World War I as kind of the first, to use the hated domino theory, the first domino to fall is this Versailles Treaty. So anyway, that's the book.
You know, then I don't want to compare McNamara to Einstein or Russell, but by the end of his life, he was calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons. And
I wondered about that. Yeah.
Yeah. In this book, in the chapter I think it's called Hindsight and Foresight, we quote him at conferences telling people, you guys wake up. There's one where he says, here we are having cookies and coffee, and we could all be destroyed. We've got to destroy those weapons before they destroy us. And I might also mention that my co-author, my brother Philip, wrote a book called The Partnership, which was about the group of former Cold Warriors who briefly thought that they could push for the abolition of nuclear weapons, including Sam Nunn, the Georgian senator, Henry Kissinger, believe it or not, George.
Sorry.
Who else? But take a look at that book. It's about their
I would love to. Yeah, I certainly have questions about that.
Partnership by Philip Taubman.
Great. Yeah, and just for the audience, this book is co-written by William and Philip Taubman. They're brothers. That must have been an interesting project, right? Writing a book with your brother.
It was very interesting. It turned out that we worked together very well. My brother jokingly says that's because I'm 6.5 years older than he has, and I had seniority to which he had to give way. But the more interesting contrast between us is that he was a journalist. He was the Moscow bureau chief and then the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times, and I'm an academic. And he's always looking for news, and I'm always looking for perspective, you might say. And that, I think, worked out well. And in the dedication to the book, we wrote for our parents who would have loved the idea of the two of us writing a book together.
Yeah, I enjoyed that. Okay, so let's talk about, so at the end of his life, McNamara comes to the conclusion that we have to abolish nuclear weapons. I think perhaps part of the reason why is that in 1995, I think, he had that missile crisis conference with Castro. And yeah. I've actually seen the photo of McNamara talking to Castro. And Castro informed him that had the United States carried out its planned military invasion of Cuba, had it performed first the bombing and then the amphibious landing, that Castro had already recommended to the Soviets to use the nuclear weapons stationed in Cuba against the United States, and that there were somewhere between 100 and 200 warheads already on the island. The initial CIA report that triggered, the Kennedy news conference and the XCOM and all of that said that, okay, sure, the missiles are here, but the warheads aren't on the island yet. And McNamara could not believe how close the United States had come to World War III over Cuba. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, well, first of all, there were a series of, as you said, a series of conferences on the Cuban crisis. I attended, I guess, 3 of them. At Hawks Cay, Florida was one. Cambridge, Massachusetts was another. And Moscow was a third. And it was in these meetings that the Soviets first revealed that they had sent not only the medium-range missiles, which could reach the United States, but they had sent battlefield nuclear weapons, which, had the United States invaded Cuba, could and probably would have been used against American troops landing in Cuba. And McNamara talks in our book, we report his reaction to this. He was stunned. We didn't know this. So it wasn't just the warheads for the medium-range missiles, it was the battlefield nuclear weapons. He was stunned that this was there and that had we invaded and they used them, then all bets were off and we might have been in a nuclear war. And in fact, the thing that you quoted, Castro's recommendation to the Soviets to go to war with nuclear weapons if the Americans invaded Cuba, was one of the things that led Khrushchev to bring the crisis to an end. He decided that this was crazy, that Castro was too much of a revolutionary if he was willing to, see the end of his regime and of his island in a nuclear exchange, and that therefore the crisis had to be stopped. But this led McNamara, and we talk about this also in that same chapter, to realize that a war could begin with the the country that has fewer weapons going first, using them first. And as McNamara said, that seems crazy. Why would the side that has fewer weapons use them and be left with none when the other side retaliated? And his answer was there is a kind of strange logic to that, which is that if you have few and you don't use them first, then you'll lose them when the other side attacks you. So if you have them, you might as well use them. And that he brought to bear on Vietnam. That was his concern, that if the United States invaded North Vietnam, if China entered the war against the United States, if the Soviet Union felt compelled to back China, then even though the Soviet Union had far fewer weapons capable of reaching the United States than the Americans had missiles capable of reaching the Soviet Union, the Soviets might go first.
Wow. Yeah, the endless Cold War game theory nightmares that can be spun out from that. And I mean, there's also, this Cold War effect of the tail wagging the dog. The smaller countries like Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, drawing in and pulling in larger powers, which kind of goes against diplomatic or strategic common sense, but it happens over and over in the Cold War, where these very far-flung places draw huge investments of military activity from the US or the Soviet Union. Happens over and over, is totally characteristic of the Cold War. But I mean, what was strange about McNamara saying that or ascribing those motives to Castro is, in The Fog of War, he relates his conversation with Castro, and he says, so what do you think would have happened to Cuba if that had taken place? If the Soviets had followed your recommendation and launched. And he says, well, Cuba, of course, would be utterly destroyed. And then McNamara says, well, that's insane. And Castro says, you would have done the same thing. And it's completely true. I mean, the United States policy of mutually assured destruction was exactly this policy. If we come under attack, we will launch an all-out barrage of nuclear missiles against the Soviet Union and China. I've read the 59 actual SAC war plan. It would use enough nuclear weapons on its own to cover the entire planet in radioactive ash. It would end all human life on Earth, and that's not even counting a Soviet counterattack. And the question that made me write this book about Einstein, Russell, the peace movement, Pugwash, the UN, all of it, is how is it exactly that it became U.S. foreign policy to literally destroy the entire planet in case of, what could have begun as an extremely minor military or strategic shift, like Vietnam, or Cuba, places that are, not the economic or strategic heartlands of, the world system by any stretch. And so it is this form of logical insanity that I am writing this book to be an extended critique of, because to me, what is truly rational, what is truly logical, is the abolition of empire and the abolition of nuclear weapons. It's the only possibility that's compatible with survival. And McNamara himself, the IBM machine with legs, comes to this conclusion at the end of his life.
Yeah, well, you'd have to follow the atomic nuclear arms race from the beginning. We developed it during World War II so as to have it against Germany, thinking that they're trying to build one too. Then we use it against Japan. Then the Soviets build them to have them against us. Then we escalate to H-bombs. The Soviets do the same. Then we have to have more. They have to have more, and on we go. And then plenty of other countries start to develop them. I mean, it's in my pessimistic moments, especially in this period of the world with Trump changing the nature of the game, and with Gaza and Ukraine and Sudan and lives being sacrificed left and right, I get pessimistic. It's a little hard to believe that the human race is going to survive.
To the extent that the possibility can be, well, quantitatively, as McNamara would try, the doomsday clock, the bulletin of atomic scientists. We are closer to midnight now in the estimate of a consortium of political scientists and nuclear scientists and environmental scientists and so on. We are closer to a terminal disaster, existential catastrophe than we were during the tensest moments of the Cold War, including the Cuban Missile Crisis. And when I look at, the border tension between India and Pakistan, that is just never ending, or the genocide in Gaza, or at just the raw fact that Trump is president, it tends to put me in a state of mind where I feel like action is impossible. But, like, just to put my cards on the table, like, I'm a pacifist, a radical leftist, and when I feel discouraged, I think about the protesters in the Vietnam War, right? Part of the reason why it was so fascinating for me for Errol Morris to ask McNamara, how did your thinking change in response to the protesters, is because I identify with those protesters. And I wonder, what is the impact of all of this speech, all of this discussion of ideas? Like, I'll never come close to making foreign policy, right? I'll never be on the Council of Foreign Relations or the National Security Council. I'll never be ambassador to the UN. And so what effect does it have on the thinking of elites to write books and to write histories and to write manifestos and to have these conversations in public? I feel like I almost just have to have faith that it has some impact. But I mean, you've won a Pulitzer Prize for your work, and you've been covering this, and writing these books for your entire life. I mean, do you feel that writing these histories has a significant impact, even many years down the road, on thinking, on policy? I find myself really hoping that it does, but I just don't know.
Well, I try to tell myself that it does. When I devoted 20 years to trying to understand Khrushchev, his whole life from the beginning, in as much detail as I could muster, so as to grab potential readers by the lapels and sort of force them to look at the day-to-day craziness that goes on. I had the feeling that it was something like the movie Saving Private Ryan. Remember the way that movie begins with that close-up of the invasion of Normandy?
Yes, they're on the boats. Yeah.
I mean, I was moved by that movie to see how close the brutality of it. And as I worked on my book on Khrushchev, I thought maybe somehow I can have an effect. And as I worked on Gorbachev, I thought maybe somehow the story of how this one man turns from a kind of doctrinaire communist into somebody who wants to get rid of totalitarianism and end the Cold War, maybe it will have an effect. I'm probably deluding myself, but that's what I said to myself. But I have one comment that takes us back to McNamara.
Sure.
Even if he said to Errol Morris, those demonstrations didn't change my mind, the immolation of that one Quaker guy who burned himself to death with McNamara looking out of the Pentagon window at him, that did have an effect on McNamara. And if he denied that, he's lying. It did have an effect on him, because we know, my brother and I discovered, that it was in the fall of 1965, that McNamara decided the war was unwinnable and he must try to bring it to an end somehow or other. And that followed his witnessing of that self-immolation.
Wow.
And it had a huge effect on him. One of the things he said later on was, but I never discussed it with my family. And I never talked about my feelings as they were shaped by that event with my wife or my children. And that, again, is that aloofness that he got from his father, if one can be that mechanistic in talking about inheritance. But it did have an effect on him. So we need, in the end, I think McNamara is a tragic figure. who did a lot of terrible things in life, but also can be a model of what one should do in some turning points in life.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny to play with the possibility of, McNamara, what McNamara's life would have been if he would have never been tapped by the Kennedy administration, if he had never gotten to Camelot. Because if everything else, with all of that subtracted, with Vietnam and Cuba and so on, with all of that gone, I mean, he probably would have gone down as just a sort of mid-century industrial icon, an effective CEO, an all-around, good guy, family man, socially minded. One of the few things that he learned from his father was tolerance of other races and other types of people. He was highly cultured, right? So, I mean, without this fateful decision to join the Kennedy administration, I think Robert McNamara would have lived basically an unimpeachable life, right? There
are other roads not taken. We have a chapter about his time at Harvard Business School, which we call, quote, the happiest years of our lives. It ends with his remembering with great fondness and nostalgia those years when he was in the Harvard environment and he was hobnobbing with other intellectuals, and he was valued by Harvard, not just by the business school. And I think we close that chapter by saying, what would have happened had he stayed on in Harvard? In fact, that's what he said later, after the war. He said, when Harvard asked him to come back, and he wanted to go back, and then he was deflected by the offer from the Ford Motor Company. What would have happened had he gone back? He would have enjoyed the concerts put on by the Boston Symphony. He would have enjoyed that world. And in fact, he tried to recreate that world when he was at the Ford Motor Company by choosing to live in Ann Arbor, where the University of Michigan is located, rather than in Dearborn, where all the other big shots of both Ford and General Motors will live, playing golf and, dressing alike and all the rest. So he was tempted by that kind of life. And if he had taken that route, I think he would have become something probably like the president of Harvard, and maybe then the right kind of politician, maybe a kind of senator, although he admits he was not a natural politician. And maybe he would have become the kind of liberal university president of whom we have other examples.
One of the strange details in McNamara agreeing to come be part of the Kennedy administration is he was really insistent that he didn't want to be socialized around the Georgetown set. He said something to the effect of, like, as long as I don't have to be around those people. And that part kind of caught my attention, because for Washington politicians in general, of course you do want to be around the Georgetown set. Those are the people with power and connections and so forth. So what do you think he meant by that? Or who were those people that he was adamant about avoiding?
Well, as you know from that chapter, he told Kennedy he wanted to be a working Secretary of Defense rather than a socializing Secretary of Defense. And he chose not to live in Georgetown, although not all that far from it either. And I think it was the sense that getting too close to powerful people can be corrupting, as it did indeed turn out to be. He allowed himself to be sort of co-opted into Kennedy's inner circle. He allowed himself to become a friend of Kennedy as well as an advisor. He allowed himself to become I'm sorry, that's my phone ringing.
That's totally fine. Just keep going.
Yeah. He allowed himself to become a dear friend of Jacqueline Kennedy. Mm-hmm. So close that one even wonders how close they eventually got.
Right. Yeah.
And he observed Kennedy being the womanizer that he was. And he observed Johnson being another kind of womanizer. And McNamara, in the end, well, this is kind of harsh, but you see what you think after reading the chapter in which we talk about McNamara's romancing women after his wife died. McNamara became a kind of womanizer himself. And as his second wife, his widow, said, that in effect, he was corrupted by Washington, by the socializing, by the intimacy, by the games playing, by the skirt chasing. So his instinct was correct, but he was overwhelmed by the temptations of Washington in so many ways.
I'm reminded of Odysseus, tying himself to the mast to get past the sirens. Like, oh yeah, like I'll do the Secretary of Defense job, but don't make me hang out with these people, and then slowly absorbing more and more of their culture over time. I do want to ask a question about Kennedy, and I understand this is one of the most heavily debated questions in Cold War history, which is Kennedy's intentions to withdraw from Vietnam. This is a whole thing that Kennedy fans are really adamant about, that if Kennedy had not been assassinated, there would have been a U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam. And they quote, these National Security Action Memorandums, I think 263, 273. And the counter arguments to that is that those documents and Kennedy's whole policy withdrawal was contingent upon victory, was contingent upon South Vietnam basically beginning to win the war against North Vietnam and to eventually militarily conquer North Vietnam. And those were the conditions for U.S. withdrawal. So what's your appraisal of the whole? Yeah.
My brother and I looked into this in some detail, and we take it up in a couple of our chapters. And we follow the evolution that you just described of Kennedy raising the question of whether they should get out, and McNamara supporting him in raising that question. And they're actually going so far as to start drawing down the number of advisors and to imagine pulling out at the end of or sometime in 1965. But we also include the statements of Kennedy, which sound very different. There's one in which he tells Walter Cronkite of CBS that, it's the Cold War classic assessment that we can't leave if that's going to risk the loss of South Vietnam. We came away with the feeling that that's what what he wanted to do was leave, and he prepared the ground to leave, but he would only leave after he was reelected, because then he'd be in power for another 4 years, and he could keep at bay the people who would charge him with having sold out and turned tail and run. So in that sense, Kennedy bought into another sort of very basic reason for our staying in Vietnam, and that was not to appear to have given up and given out, because that would be punished in American domestic politics. That the real threat to people like Kennedy who wanted to pull out was not the left wing, not the people who were telling him to pull out, but the right wing who would punish him if he pulled out. Now that's very interesting, because that's yet another kind of argument that was made for staying in Vietnam. But it's a crazy argument in a way, because it's saying the real reason we have to stay and fight this war with all of its losses and of life and everything else is not only that the Russians will learn the lesson that we can't be pushed around, but that the right wing in America will use it against us. In other words, it's the politics of America that requires us to stay and fight in Vietnam.
A lesson that Kennedy enacted in 1960 when he ran against Richard Nixon and accused Richard Nixon of being too soft on communism, and of having allowed the missile gap to grow. And then the moment he comes to office, McNamara turns around and says, we weren't correct about the missile gap. It's actually in our favor, not theirs. But, Kennedy outflanked Nixon from the right on foreign policy in the 1960 election. And I think he was worried about something similar happening with Goldwater. And I wonder how Goldwater would have fared in the election against Johnson if he had just not discussed using nuclear weapons in Vietnam. That this is another major question I have is this one I'm not very clear on. Maybe you can help me, but there was a rumor that began, I think, in 72 or 73, that Nixon was considering using nuclear weapons in Vietnam, that he had discussed this with Henry Kissinger, kind of floated the idea. Kissinger had freaked out and then leaked it to the news. And then there was a huge protest in response. I don't think Johnson ever seriously considered using nuclear weapons in Vietnam. I think the French did in the 50s. I think they asked the United States for nuclear assistance in Vietnam. But do you think Nixon ever contemplated nuclear weapons in Vietnam?
That I don't know. We didn't really study the Nixon years of the war in that kind of detail. I do remember this, though. When I graduated from college in 1962 and entered graduate school. And at one point, I was assigned to be a rapporteur for a group of fairly high-level officials or former officials or observers talking about the war and about international affairs in general. And I remember vividly being shocked as I sat there taking notes that they were talking about whether nuclear weapons should be used in Vietnam. Nobody came out and said we should. They certainly didn't reach agreement that we should. But I remember being stunned by they were discussing it as what sounded to me a serious possibility. I suspect they would have backed off and not done it. They would have, in the end, just as all these years we haven't done it again after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But that's another reason to be scared today, because Putin is talking about it, and the Indians and Pakistanis both possess it. And if peace isn't arrived at in the Middle East, eventually Saudi Arabia will want them, and Japan will want them if they can't count on us. So that the world is moving in that direction, alas.
Yes.
Alas.
There have been a number of articles with headlines like the coming nuclear doubling, where all these new nations, like you said, a few of them, Saudi Arabia, Japan, Turkey, could all consider acquiring nuclear weapons. I think that would be a disaster for international security of the first order. One of the least reported and discussed moments during the first Trump administration, I hate having to say that it was just the first, but was when Trump encouraged Japan to develop nuclear weapons because he was fixated on the price of defending Japan and extending U.S. naval assets in the region. He thought he wasn't getting a good deal with Japan with the nuclear umbrella and the base in Okinawa, and he wanted the Japanese to pay more for their U.S. military occupation. Yeah. And the Japanese said no. And then Trump said, well, then we're going to pull back our Navy and our Air Force. And the Japanese said, how do you expect us to defend ourselves from North Korea, which regularly launches nuclear missiles, over the island and so forth? And Trump says, well, that's obvious. You'll just have to acquire nuclear weapons of your own. Mm-hmm. First of all, just in case anyone cares about international law, it is illegal under the Non-Proliferation Treaty for countries that have nuclear weapons to help countries that don't acquire them. And it is illegal for countries that don't have nuclear weapons, like Japan, to acquire them as well. And nobody noticed this foreign policy thing happening during Trump because there was just so many other crazy events that it got piled under. But like I read Bob Woodward's most recent book, which is just called War. Yep. And there's a fascinating moment in that book where Lindsey Graham is talking to Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, about this possibility of Saudi Arabia acquiring nuclear weapons. And Graham is saying like the United States would be against that. We would regard that as a major threat to our security, and we would work with the IAEA to prevent you from acquiring the uranium and so forth. And MBS just says, oh, we wouldn't do like a Manhattan Project or anything like that. And Graham goes, well, like, how would you get a nuclear bomb then? And MBS just says, we just buy it from the Pakistanis.
Gone.
What a time to be alive.
Yeah, let me just say one more thing. I think when it comes to crazy decisions that a president might make, and the question of whether his advisors, his cabinet members will warn him against or even leave or threaten to leave in protest, McNamara becomes a very interesting case study because essentially McNamara stays. McNamara stays rather than tell his president, don't do it, get out of Vietnam, leave. And if McNamara, with all of his brilliance and arrogance and power and independence as compared to, say, Pete Hegseth, won't do it, then who will do it? Well, to be sure, some of the people in the first Trump administration did resist and even resign. So it's not impossible, but certainly in this administration, it looks impossible.
Yeah, well, to say another name, Colin Powell and the Iraq War, another person who thought, oh, I can just fix the system from within. I can temper all these hawkish tendencies, and if I'm the guy running Afghanistan, if I'm the guy that's running Iraq, then it'll be good for the troops or whatever. When in reality he should have resigned. And yeah, I mean, in the first Trump administration, there were adults in the room because it was still an experiment, and the GOP was really concerned that Trump would basically run the country off the rails, which, yeah, they were correct to be concerned. I've read the entire Bob Woodward trilogy. I think it's called Fear, Rage, and Peril, of, his fly on the wall reporting of what happened in the White House. The very first scene in the very first book is a scene where the economic advisor, Gary Cohn, in working with a man who basically handles all the paperwork flow for the Oval Office, so the guy that puts things on desks and makes sure stuff gets the right signature, they put their heads together and they steal a document off of Trump's desk that he was intent on signing. And what that document was a withdrawal from a defense pact with South Korea, because, again, South Korea wasn't paying enough protection money. And what that would have resulted in, if that had happened, is that the early nuclear missile detection facilities that we run in South Korea, which can detect a North Korean nuclear launch something like 15 or 20 minutes before other like satellite-based or US-based detectors could run, those would have all gotten the plug pulled out from under them. And so they looked at each other and they said, we can't let Trump sign this. And he has the attention span of a goldfish. And if we steal this off his desk, he'll forget that it ever existed. And he did. And that's the reason we still have a defense pact with South Korea.
Ouch.
Ouch. Last question. If you could have given advice to Robert McNamara when he was first joining Camelot in 1960, 1961, if you could have came in and given him guidance on his thinking, obviously you're coming from the future, so no warning about specific events or specific outcomes, but how do you think Robert McNamara's perspective could have been corrected in such a way that he wouldn't have made some of the disastrous assumptions that he did about the Vietnam War, like the whole emphasis on body count, for example? What advice would you have given McNamara at an earlier stage in his life?
That's a very tricky question because, of course, if I were the age I was at that time, I wouldn't have dared to give him any advice at all. I would have been 20 years old. And now in retrospect, it's much easier to imagine it, but it's much more unrealistic because it's so many years later. But I guess I would have urged him to preserve his independence, both of thought and of action, and not to get beguiled and seduced by all that Washington seems to offer in the way of power and glamour and everything else. I mean, that had been, in a way, that's what he prided himself on. He talks about one of the things that he had done in his earlier life, especially at the Ford Motor Company, was to insist that accepted wisdom be challenged, that people ask themselves the hard questions and get together and thrash them out rather than proceed without that kind of self-scrutiny. So in a sense, if I had known then that this was his own philosophy, his own credo, then I would have been talking to the convicted or the already convinced, because in a way, and he chides himself in his book for not doing that. And it's also very interesting that in his book, he asks the question, or if not in the book, then in the interviews leading up to it, he asks the question, why did I not do that? That was my modus operandi. Why did I not do that? And in effect, he says, I'm still trying to understand myself. I don't know why I behaved the way I did. Well, in our book, we're trying to explain why he behaved the way he did, but he's no longer around to profit, if that's the right word, from what we learned about him.
Thank you so much, Bill. McNamara at War, available September 23rd by Philip and William Taubman. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I've had a great time with this interview.
Well, I enjoyed talking to you. You know a lot, and you have some important convictions, and I was glad to hear them expressed.
If you've enjoyed this ad-free interview or any of the material that I post without ads or copyright on the History of Philosophy audio archive, it would mean the world to me if you would come to the Patreon page, either as a free member where I post everything I ever post first, or as a paid member. There are about a dozen of you out there right now that are making the entire enterprise possible. For a writer working on a manuscript, a podcaster making an ad-free podcast, and a researcher who often wants to spend more time digging into books than there are hours in the day, a little bit of extra cash goes an awfully long way in keeping the quality and the pace of this little program up where it deserves to be. So if you are able, it would mean the world to me. Thanks for listening.